All right, so this is our Innovation and Entrepreneurship in Academic Anesthesiology session. And Professor Doug Rains from Mass General and Harvard Medical School is here to kick it off with his story about etomidate derivatives and Innova BioPharma.
Well, I'd like to start out by thanking the Society for inviting me to talk about something that I really haven't talked about before. Usually when I'm standing up here speaking, it's about my science, so this will be only kind of tangentially related to my science. But I hope this is informative and interesting for all of you. I usually start out with a disclosure slide, but I think it's fair to say that this entire talk is one big disclosure. So this is the outline. What I'd like to do is just very briefly give you a touch, really with just a slide or so, a brief background in the science and the intellectual property that we developed, and talk about our initial attempts to license the technology, ultimately the formation of Annovation BioPharma, a startup company, to develop that technology, which involved a series of steps ranging from hiring a CEO to raising funding for this company, the funding rounds of which we had two, and then ultimately its acquisition by a fairly large-sized pharmaceutical company. So first, the background. In early 2007, my laboratory at MGH, which is an NIH-funded laboratory, began a program to try to develop better anesthetic drugs. We did basic and translational studies, and these included a range of things: medicinal chemistry, computational chemistry, in vitro studies in adrenocortical cells and GABA receptors, as well as in vivo studies in small animals like tadpoles and rats. A number of the compounds that we made looked as though they might have some potential either as lead drugs or as actual clinical drugs. You heard a little bit about that this morning with Ken Johnson's talk. These included mock-etomidate and CPMM, which are rapidly metabolized ester-based analogs of etomidate, so-called soft etomidate analogs. And the concept there was that was to make a drug with reduced adrenal cortical suppression activities, and at the same time was so rapidly metabolized that consciousness could be turned on and off almost as though this drug were a pharmacologic switch of consciousness. Another drug that we had was one called carboetomidate, which was the lead drug of a series of pyrrole etomidate analogs that was completely devoid of adrenal suppressive activity. So we filed a disclosure to MGH in 2007, which is really when the idea sort of first started developing, and as a requirement of my employment there. And then MGH filed patent applications beginning in 2008 that would cover the technology that we were developing, effectively these new drugs. And then I learned I had my first business partner, which is MGH. So even though this technology was invented in my laboratory is at MGH, I'm an employee there, and so MGH owned the technology that I developed in my lab. And the reason that they own it really dates back to the Bayh-Dole Act, which was from 1980, which says that universities, nonprofits like hospitals such as MGH, and small businesses can retain intellectual ownership of intellectual property that is developed with federal funding, such as NIH funding from my laboratory. And the history of this was, after World War I, federal funding for research started increasing fairly rapidly, and there were lots of patents that were applied for. In fact, about 28,000 patents by the 1970s. The vast majority of these patents were never commercialized in any way. And one of the reasons that they weren't commercialized was that the ownership of that intellectual property was unclear. Was it owned by the government that had funded this research, or was it owned by the laboratories and institutions where that research had been performed? And because that ownership was unclear, it was very hard to license that technology out. The analogy that I like to think about is a house or a piece of land in which the title is unclear. Who's going to go in and invest money in that property? So this created a few problems because this intellectual property wasn't being licensed. There were obviously concerns regarding the improvement of public health since the basic science wasn't being translated into new therapies. There were also economic concerns because there weren't new businesses being created out of these new technologies. So here's where the Bayh-Dole Act came into being in 1980, and its purpose was to help facilitate this technology transfer from nonprofits to the commercial world by defining ownership. So these are the key elements of the Bayh-Dole Act. Entities such as nonprofits, hospitals, could file for patent applications for intellectual property that they had developed if they wanted to own that property. But it came with some requirements. One of those requirements was to actively promote the commercialization of that intellectual property, which explains why all these tech transfer offices opened up at our universities and hospitals. The government retained what are referred to as marching rights, which means that if a licensee doesn't commercialize that technology, if they simply sit on it, then the government can come in and take that license away and reassign it to someone else who will commercialize that technology. The Bayh-Dole Act also gave preferences to small businesses. Again, part of this was not simply to improve public health, but was really sort of an economic stimulus act. Perhaps that's how they got Republicans on board. And it required that licensed products be made substantially in the United States. Government retained use for certain IP uses, the IP for certain uses. There were certain reporting obligations that the institutions then had back to the government. And then it required that licensing income be shared with the inventors of the technology. So each institution has its own way of dividing up any royalties, milestones, licensing payments that might come into the institutions based on that sort of licensing activity. At MGH, it's divided into 4 equal parts. MGH keeps 1/4 of that, of what comes in for themselves. 1/4 of that goes to the inventor's department. 1/4 of that goes to the inventor's laboratories. And 25%, 1/4 of that goes to the inventors themselves. So, as I said, MGH owns the technology, retained the rights to the technology, so they could choose to license it to anyone they chose, and then again, licensing fees, royalties, milestones, come back to the institution, and then they get divvied out. What I learned was that although MGH is a pretty big institution and has actually a fair amount of experience with commercialization of technology, they really weren't very well equipped to help me get to the next stage. They didn't understand the technology. They don't really understand anesthesia very well, just that you need anesthesia to do surgery. They didn't know the market very well, and part of that is because, again, there aren't too many anesthetics have made it to market over the last 20 years. And finally, they don't have a development budget. So, but what they were willing to do is help me find a commercial partner. Ideally, a large company that would come in, license this technology at an early stage, and sort of be a one-stop shop. So that sort of was plan A. So basically, big company would come in, license the technology, do all the preclinical studies, efficacy, potency, all the work that's needed to scale up the synthesis of the drug, the formulation, all the regulatory filings and the clinical studies, and eventually take it to market. So again, the sort of one-stop shopping. And then I would just go back to my lab and do my thing. And they approached about a dozen different companies, and I'm sure you know these quite well, to see if they were interested in taking this very early stage technology and advancing it through clinical trials to market. And sort of the responses that we got were actually quite stereotypical. They were very interested in the idea of developing a new anesthetic, but it was too early. At that point, we had small animal studies, rats, tadpoles, we had receptor studies, but we certainly didn't have any human studies, and they wanted to see human studies. They wanted to see if this drug would work in people before they would commit to a more significant investment of time, energy, and money. So that was sort of the easy plan, Plan A, and so that sort of went by the wayside, and we went to Plan B, which was to form a startup company. And the name of the startup company, I called it Annovation BioPharma, which is a combination of anesthesia and innovation. My daughter at the time, I have to say this, my daughter at the time, she was 8 years old, she thought I should have called it Doug's Drugs. But we thought it was quite cute, but you know, you have to be a little serious when you walk into a VC and ask for a few $1 million. So we thought that probably wouldn't fly. So the idea of a startup company is you take all of these things that the one-stop large pharma would do, and you split it into two pieces. So the plan was to do some of the very early stuff, so the preclinical efficacy testing, the preclinical pharmacology, begin to optimize the synthesis and do the formulation, do the IND submission so that clinical trials could be done, and then do some proof of principle phase 1 studies, so that the company then reaches a value inflection point when a large pharmaceutical company, for example, might come in then and make an acquisition and take it all the way to the next step. And that's sort of the common exit strategy that occurs with startup companies. The other possibility is the startup company continues to grow, takes on more investments, continues to develop the product until you get to the point where you have an exit as an IPO on the basically you go public. So those are sort of the two options. So with the startup, this was basically our plan. But I didn't know anything about how to start a startup company. And so I needed some experience. I needed someone to help me run this company, basically an experienced CRO, because there were still a lot of things to do. I had to license the technology from the hospital because I didn't own the technology. Had to develop a business plan so that we could go in front of investors and convince them that this was a good idea and would be a good investment for them. We had to hire a law firm in order to form the company, incorporate the company, distribute company stock. And then we would have to hire contract research organizations to actually do the preclinical development that would allow us to get this into clinical trials. But I also needed money from investors because MGH wanted an upfront fee for the license. And they also would want eventual milestone payments, so on an annual basis. And in addition, every time we reached the next step in the development process, they wanted money back from the startup. Had to pay the CEO's salary. And again, I needed money to hire the CROs. And so this created sort of a catch-22 because I needed money to form the company, but I also needed a company to be able to attract investment in the company. So the solution that I came up with was I sat down with the CEO and I gave him a piece of the company and a promise that I would pay him sometime in the future when we had enough investment so that we could afford to provide him with a salary. Sat down with the law firm and talked to them, and they were willing to do the work on a contingency basis. So, which meant that they would get paid if and when we got funding, investment above a certain number of dollars. So they were willing to take a risk that they might do the work and they may never get paid. And I think the reason for this has, to a large degree, to do with timing. So this was now 2009. We were in the midst of the recession. There were a whole lot more lawyers than there was legal work. And so they were willing to take a chance that they might do work and not get paid, but that was, I think in their minds, preferable to not do any work and having no chance of getting paid. So they agreed to that. And then we went back to MGH to try to negotiate the license, because again, that would be, in essence, at this point, the company's only asset. And a new player emerged from the East. This was a mid-sized pharmaceutical company that's privately held. It was based in Japan. They had learned about this technology actually not from the hospital, but actually from reading journal articles, and seeing what we had published in this area, and saw that we were developing new anesthetic agents and thought that they might be able to get in on this. The name of the company you may or may not know, but I think you'll recognize the product. So this is Mariucci Pharmaceuticals. They hold the license for sevoflurane. They're based in Japan, and they have sub-licensed sevoflurane in the United States to Abbott Laboratories. But in fact, they are the actual license holder. So they were already in the market of anesthetics, or at least an anesthetic, and the hospital was really quite interested, because they looked at the startup, Annovation BioPharma, and they saw a company with no money and lots of debt, and they looked at Mariucci, and they saw a company with lots of money and the potential to basically take this project to completion. And so that created a sort of a little bit of tension, a little bit of competition for this technology. But there was a problem with Mariucci. And some of it relates to the Bayh-Dole Act, which gives preferences to small business licensees, like Annovation BioPharma. The second thing is that licensed products under the Bayh-Dole Act must be substantially made in the US. Now, Mariucci, in theory, could have done that, but they had no plan to do that. They have no production facilities within the US. The third aspect of this is, in general, institutions are reluctant to separate the baby from the mother. So if an inventor wants to pursue something like this, a startup company, and develop the technology, most institutions try to be quite accommodating. And then the fourth issue that arose was just one of speed. And this may have been a cultural difference. So Mariucci came over, they flew over from Japan with their staff, met with me, met with the hospital. But after 6 months, there was still no agreement. There was still no willingness to sign on the dotted line. And so in the end, the hospital walked away and gave an option for the license to Annovation. So Annovation got a 1-year option for the license at no cost. And basically all Annovation needed to do now is raise funding in order to pay for the license, because there would be, within the 1-year period of time, there would be fees. And of course, they had to raise money to do all the studies that needed to be done and to form the company. So now we move on to financing the startup BioPharma, Annovation BioPharma. So Massachusetts General Hospital is part of a larger network of hospitals called Partners Healthcare. The Brigham is the other major hospital within that network. It's one of the founding members. There are about another half a dozen hospitals that are also part of Partners Healthcare. They did something in 2007 that I think was really quite innovative. They created an internal venture capital group. So MGH and the Brigham contributed $35 million to form a VC group called the Partners Innovation Fund. And that $35 million was designated to be used to develop technologies that were created within the Partners Healthcare network. So things like our drugs, to invest in companies like ours. It's run by real VCs. It has an investment board made up of external VCs, academicians, people in business. They provide both money and insight, mentoring into these sort of startup companies. And they do it as an evergreen fund, meaning that any money that's brought in as profit is then reinvested in other companies, again, within the Partners Healthcare network. So for me, they provided mentorship to get this project off the ground. They performed market analyses. Again, they needed to do that anyway if they were planning to invest in our company as part of their due diligence. They provided seed money in exchange for preferred stock in the company. And one of the things that was probably equally important at that point is that they established both credibility in the project as well as connections with external VCs. Because they were going to invest some, but they weren't going to invest enough to get this project over the finish line. So we were going to need some more investment in addition to what Partners Innovation Fund could or would supply to us. So we looked to external investors. And I think about external investors as sort of coming in as in three different flavors. There are angel investors, venture capital firms, and strategic partners. And so angel investors, these are individuals, relatively high net worth individuals, like probably most of the people who are sitting here. They invest their own money, but the investments tend to be relatively modest. Typical investment could be anywhere from $5,000 to, let's just say, $20,000, $50,000. So they tend to be relatively modest. There are angel investor groups that sometimes invest together as groups. In Boston, there are a number of angel investors and several angel investor groups, some of which even specialize in medical technologies. If we go a little bit larger, there are venture capital firms, and these are companies that raise rounds of funding and then use that funding to invest in technologies, in startup companies. They earn a management fee based on those investments, as well as a share of the profits. And they're able to give much larger investments, so it might be, say, $1 million to up to tens of millions of dollars. And then there are strategic partners. So these are typically mid to large size companies that invest with company funds. They have an interest typically in the area where the startup company is doing its development. They provide important mentoring for the startup company, advisory services to the startup company, and at the same time are potential buyers for the startup company. Again, if those trials, if the startup company development work is successful. So we talked to a couple of angel investor groups. One in particular was Mass Medical Angels, who again their entire focus is on investing in medical technologies, drugs and devices. 9 of their investors elected to invest in Annovation BioPharma for at least a first round of funding. And they invested simultaneously with the Partners Innovation Fund, again, our internal VC group. Both the angel investors and Partners Innovation Fund received preferred stock for that. And then we went out and started talking to venture capital firms, and we talked to a series of them. What we were looking for was a venture capital firm that had knowledge and experience in the medical field, right? So some VC funds that are focused on applications on your phone, software, things that have nothing, Uber, things that have nothing to do with medicine. We want somebody who would understand the technology and could help us with its development. We wanted a venture capital group that would have sufficient funds to be able to take us over our finish line, and ideally agree to some reasonable pre-money valuation so that we wouldn't lose the entirety of the company in a first round of funding. So we wound up partnering with a group called Atlas Venture. They're located in Boston and Cambridge. They've been around for a fairly long time, more than 30 years. They'd had something like 10 previous funds. The most recent fund at the time was about $300 million, so they clearly had money that they could invest in Annovation BioPharma. And the other thing that was actually kind of nice is the folks that I dealt with at Atlas were all physicians. They were physicians who had left medicine and had gone into the business world. So they very clearly understood what the medical need was and could help, and their expertise was really invaluable. So in 2011, we had the seed funding round. It was, the participants were the Partners Innovation Fund, those 9 angel investors, along with Atlas Venture. It was a relatively modest seed round. It was $750,000, but it allowed us to do several important things. Probably the most important thing was to actually exercise that option for the license from MGH. And that license included things like upfront fees for the license. The hospital asked for a small bit of equity in Annovation BioPharma. They wanted to be reimbursed for the patent costs that they incurred. At this point, we had, I don't know, 4 or 5 patents. and had generated probably about $40,000 or $50,000 worth of patent attorney expenses, or they had. They wanted to be paid for milestones. There was the license to find the royalty payments, penalties for not developing that technology on a certain time scale, sub-licensing terms, and so some reporting responsibilities of the company back to the hospital. We also used the money to pay for the lawyers that had been working on this contingency basis, to hire consultants, to hire CROs, and to start the development of the project. So this was now 2011. Around the same time, Annovation and the venture capitalists started interacting with a pharmaceutical company strategic partner called the Medicines Company. They're a mid-sized pharmaceutical company with a market cap on the NASDAQ of roughly $2.5 billion. They had an existing acute care business and were beginning to enter the anesthesia/critical care world. And they agreed to invest in our subsequent round, so the Series A round, and also had an option to acquire the company once certain development milestones were met. And the idea was then they would be this large pharmaceutical company that would acquire the company, do the remainder of the clinical trials, do the sales, do the marketing, and finally bring the drug to patients. So a year later, in 2012, we had a Series A financing round. The participants were all the participants that were in the original seed rounding fund, Atlas Venture, Partners Innovation Fund, as well as all 9 of the previous angel investors who had invested in the seed round, elected to reinvest in the Series A financing round. This investment was significantly larger. This was on the order of about $10 million. And that allowed the startup company to do things like drug formulation work, to hire a project director, hire more consultants, do the IND enabling studies in animals, efficacy, toxicity studies, and then to start the proof of concept clinical trials in man. So then in February 2015, having met the milestones or the I guess the triggering events for the option, Annovation BioPharma was acquired by the Medicines Company for an upfront payment, along with potential additional payments, and these are very sort of typical kind of terms that you would have. So additional milestone payments as well as royalty payments sort of mirrors the type of agreement that the startup company actually had with the hospital. And then, of course, with that, the Medicines Company acquired all of Annovation's assets, which included the license agreement from MGH, as well as the data package that had been developed during this development period of time. And again, they also get Annovation's liabilities, which include the obligations that went along with MGH's license, along with the obligation to pay any milestone and royalties back to MGH for that license. So this is sort of the life cycle of this company. It's sort of showing it as, each of the different major steps. Started as an idea in 2007 as really a scientific idea that was developed in the laboratory. The first patent applications were filed in 2008. Annovation was formed about a year and a half later at the end of 2009. Seed funding in 2011, rather modest, but it helped us get off the ground. The real funding occurred in 2012 with the Series A funding that included a strategic partner. And then that strategic partner acquired the company in the beginning of 2015. So this is sort of the final slide. I wanted to make this a final comment about the importance of academic and industry partnerships. So we all work in our labs, and we sort of hope that someday our work will somehow magically change the way we care for patients. It's a little bit of a fantasy because it takes a whole lot more than that. And it takes interactions with industry in order to translate what we do in the laboratory to actually improving patient care. So we need to be able to interact with companies. And in our experience, there were a lot of different people who had to play a role in this in order to get to the stage where we are. So obviously MGH, the research that we've done, the investments that they've made, external investors who provided the funding in order to get the work done, Annovation BioPharma, which was the vehicle for getting all of this preclinical work done and early clinical work, and ultimately the medicines company for really providing expertise, financing, and then being willing to take the ball and take it over the goal line. So these sort of industry, academic industry partnerships are highly encouraged by Congress. In fact, in some ways you can say it was really the purpose of the original Bayh-Dole Act. It's highly encouraged by NIH leadership because they answer to Congress. And the people who are giving us our money to do research want to know what we're doing with that money and how it's improving patient health. I think perhaps to a lesser degree, from my own experience, the filtering down to perhaps NIH study sections is a little more variable. But I think there needs to be a recognition, and I'll just get on my soapbox, a little bit of a recognition that there are things that we do in our laboratories that need to be translated, and the role that that industry has in helping that is very, very important. And it's important to try to keep those barriers from getting too high. So I tried to leave a little bit of time at the end of this so that if people have questions about our approaches, what we did, and questions about anything that I've said, we probably have about 5 or 10 minutes or so. Thank you.
All right, Doug. Thanks for this talk. This was very interesting. I wonder how you do this with your clinical obligations. You know, you did not answer that question yet. How did your contract change with MGH?
My contract didn't change at all. So MGH and Harvard have very strict rules regarding interactions with industry. Runs pages and pages long. So everything I do at MGH is exactly the same as it's always been. In my discussions with, there's an office for interactions with industry. I'm required to make certain disclosures before I give talks, or when I write papers. I receive, in particular for the startup, I could receive no money from the startup to do any research. I could not have a managing role in the company in Annovation BioPharma because I was a founder and stockholder in the company. So there are pretty tight restrictions about what you can and can't do. Mostly it's a lot of stuff you can't do, so it didn't actually change anything that I did at MGH.
Doug, a wonderful talk. What happened, what would you do if you had another idea that was unique and different? Would you do it the same way? Would you do it differently? What have you learned from going through this whole process that took almost 10 years, not quite, and explain to the audience how you might do it differently?
Yeah. I'd like to think that this has been a fairly successful endeavor and that most of the steps that we took were correct and that there wasn't much in this that I would change. I think what's happened through the process, particularly over the last 4 or 5 years, is I've learned a lot about interactions with venture capitalists, what their needs are, what they look for in a technology, how they devise an exit strategy, what the role of a strategic partner is, how to value a company. So those are all things I knew very little about. And so I think that the most useful thing I did in this whole travel is to learn as much as I could for myself. You need to learn the vocabulary. You need to know about what stock options are and preferred stock and pre-money valuation, all of those things, inflection point valuation. You have to understand what those mean before you can sit down at a table with a venture capitalist and know that you're not being taken for a ride. Okay, so I think that probably, would I do anything different? No, but I would be more knowledgeable the next time around.
A very simple question. Do you think that in hindsight, at any stage, people or venture capital or MGH really tried to take advantage of you and rip you off? No, I mean, because this is like, what you just said is like, no, you're inexperienced, right? You're entering a completely new world, and that you could be a very easy victim.
So I will say that I think that the venture capitalists were very good, very sharp. I would say that 90% of the time we were at the same side of the table, but the other 10% of the time we weren't. There wasn't a complete convergence, obviously, of our interests, particularly in the early days. They had pretty sharp elbows, and they knew what they wanted. And so in those instances, it's just like anything else. And when you walk in to buy a car, it's how much do you want the car, and what other cars are available. And so you're looking at that the same way, and they're looking at that. What other technologies are out there? How much am I interested in the technologies? And from your perspective, you're saying, what are the other venture capital options? What are they offering? What does their term sheet look like? And making a decision. And what is their expertise? There's a little bit of a focus on the financial side because you need the money to do the work. But I'll tell you, the expertise that comes with many VCs is at least as important. And I think that's true with a strategic partner as well. The money is important to keep the project going, but they have to have the right mindset, and they have to have the right knowledge. And you have to, in the end, you have to feel comfortable with them. At some point in almost all companies, startup companies, you as the founder are going to lose control. Okay, and the day that your share drops below 50%, you no longer call the shots. And you have to be comfortable with that. And I know people who have sort of gotten into this who feel very uncomfortable with that. And so to the extent that you can surround yourself with venture capital, strategic partners, and so forth, investors who are like-minded with you and see the goal of getting the drug over the finish line, the better off you'll be, the more comfortable you'll be with the whole process.
So Doug, thank you. I'm wondering if you maybe can contextualize this story a little more for us, in the sense that many of us are aware, for instance, that Big Pharma doesn't do as much research as it did, a couple decades ago. It farms it out. It reduces its risk by partnering with smaller, more mobile companies. And so how typical is your story? Does Plan A work at MGH for a lot of our colleagues who are trying to bring their ideas to market? Or is Plan B actually becoming more and more the approach that works?
That's a terrific question, Stuart. My sense is Plan B is becoming more and more common. That companies, particularly the larger companies, are doing less innovation within their walls, in their laboratories, and are depending on bringing things from outside in. And so I think that has implications for all of us about how we think again. And that was sort of one of the purposes of my last slide, to emphasize how important it is and how much industry is now relying on us as researchers, as academics, to actually take a step, the next step, that perhaps 20 or 30 years ago we wouldn't be doing, but would actually be done in Big Pharma. So we've actually, in some regard, have taken on the role of being the innovators for the biotech industry.
All right, one last question here.
From one perspective, anesthesia is very attractive. You're looking at very rapid pharmacodynamic endpoints, unlike Alzheimer's or COPD, where it evolves over decades. But the other side of the coin, what does the market look like when you approach these people? Do they feel there's unmet need? Do they feel if you subspecialize it and segregate it, it gets into problems?
That's another great question. And I think that we deal with it, so where we first dealt with that were with investors. And the question was, and I remember one investor saying, we're not convinced that this is going to be $1 billion a year. And so we don't do anything less than $1 billion or $2 billion a year. Atlas was quite interested in the project for the very reasons you mentioned up front. which was the nice thing about an anesthetic is that you know almost everything you need to know about the drug in a phase 1 clinical trial in any individual patients within 10 seconds of giving it to them. And so the development pathway is potentially very fast, relatively low risk. For those of us who do anesthesia research, we know that anesthetic that works in a fruit fly works in a human. It's just a question of toxicity that varies. And so from that aspect, it had a very attractive risk-reward profile. And I think that's what excited Atlas when they invested a fair amount of money. And I suspect that's what interested the medicines company, who not only saw this as a relatively low risk, lower expense development project, but also saw the potential significant impact on the entire field of anesthesia to change what we do, with the hope that the pharmacologic switch, the on-off switch, would be something that could be achieved, has yet to be achieved.